I'm Jane Davidson, and I have spent the last 9 years working in the University of Wales, looking after the sustainability, and before that I spent 12 years in the Welsh Government with a responsibility for education and then for sustainability and the environment.
We want to be here surrounded by life, like almost fighting plants and having things growing up all over the place.
When you ask me about One Planet developments, they for me were part of this bigger picture. If we all live as though we only had one planet at our disposal, I believe that we will live better lives, more community orientated lives, and that our lives will be richer for that sharing with each other, for that sharing of food, for that sharing of time, for that sharing of tools, for that sharing of knowledge, all very important in terms of a community base.
Now, I just want to feel like we're living in the wild, surrounded by all this kind of stuff, rather than concrete and tarmac. We've got grass and trees and fruit bushes and all those kinds of things instead.
If we live as though we have many more planets at our disposal, as most advanced cultures live, then in fact we live very separate lives. We want to acquire more and more possessions. We measure each other by the standard of those possessions.
Just over 7 years ago, Matt and Carys Watkinson bought about 3 acres of hillside pasture in southwest Wales. Their aim was to escape the hassle of life in Essex and create a healthy home for their children by living both on and from the land.
We're in the same boat, heading for different shores.
For me, it's always been about what ways could I help in actually contributing policy to help people live lower carbon lives. And one of those areas, which has become very interesting in Wales and has attracted a lot of international attention, has been my policy called One Planet Developments.
The One Planet Development Scheme, enacted in 2011, was devised to help people in rural areas set up sustainable communities in zero carbon housing and to derive an income from their land with as low a carbon footprint as possible.
For you to have a One Planet development, it means that you are prepared to commit yourself to living a low or zero carbon future. That you're prepared to either build your own house or get help to do that so that it is zero carbon.
Carys and Matt were already living on their land, below a famous Pembrokeshire beauty spot called Carningley, before they heard about One Planet developments. After a huge struggle, they met all the criteria demanded of them and have received many accolades for what they've achieved. Their attitude to the demands of a zero-carbon lifestyle is to reuse as many things as possible. This includes materials that are usually regarded as scrap. They're currently living in a cluster of cleverly adapted, disused vehicles and are determined to blend in with their surroundings as much as they can.
We use an awful lot of old tractor tyres that we found off farms. I've now worked out how to cut them up by hand, and then we can turn them into paths for getting around the farm and things like that. And if we don't cut them up, we just use them as raised beds, so fill them full of the chicken bedding and then grow food in those. So we're trying to find uses for everything. So this is old cars, like this one is worth 50 quid scrap, but actually is a brilliant greenhouse.
Facing each other, grasping at different oars.
I'm Erica Thompson. I live on a One Planet development here in Wales, and I'm also the chair of the One Planet Council, which is a voluntary body which works to support and promote One Planet development in Wales. We'd been wondering what to do for a while, my husband and I, and eventually we read the One Planet development practice guidance, and we just looked at it and thought, wow, this is what we want to do.
You are then prepared to live at least half your life from the land, and anything that is land-based might count. It might be about looking after bees, it might be about making baskets, it might be about making makeup and aromatherapy or other contributions, it might be about selling firewood, it could be anything related to the land. But if you're prepared to live half your life delivering on an income that is related to the land, then you will be allowed land at agricultural prices on which to build your house.
The house, we dug the foundations in February 2017, and then over the next 18 months everything went up, you know. So we've got a timber frame that was built for us by a local workers cooperative. We didn't do that ourselves, we thought we'd leave that to the experts. And then the walls are straw bale with lime plaster on the outside and clay plaster on the inside. It's not a crazy grand designs type thing. It's something that's built on a budget, done with a lot of our own labour over a fairly long time, and that results in it being a bit cheaper than average.
I think that the really important element for me in why I got involved in environmental policy actually goes back to my childhood. I was brought up in Africa. I was brought up in Zimbabwe, where my father was out there to start a multiracial medical school. And I just think that that period of my life, between about the age of 4 and 16, shaped me completely. I learned about racism, and I've campaigned against racism ever since. I learned about equality, and I've campaigned for equality ever since. And in particular, I learned about the importance of the environment. I never saw anybody waste anything. And when I was sent to school in the UK when I was 14, I was so shocked by the consumption of people in the UK, and that shock has never left me.
We're in the same boat, heading for different shores. I've chosen my path, and you've chosen yours.
So it was really nice and warm, because that was the first thing we had up here, so we moved up in that. And then just had a couple of caravans here as bedrooms, and then we got hold of these big flatbed trailers, so there's 2 here, and then we've built the cabin, this kind of cabin on top of the flatbed trailers. Yeah, so we were living in an estate in Essex, so just, you know, concrete jungle, and we were both both vets, but I was practicing as a small animal vet, and Matthew was doing like film and TV extra stuff, so that was much more exciting than what I was doing. Yeah, and we had a little garden, and we had 2 chickens, and we were growing some things. You know, that was the first time we'd ever grown anything, and just seeing how we went. Really, we weren't that good at it, but we just thought, you know, we kind of knew that we wanted to start growing things and doing things then, and we were there for a couple of years, and that's when we really decided that we wanted to get a bigger piece of our own land and grow, you know, much more things and become much more self-reliant and self-sustainable, really.
These are I think they're 250 watts each, so it's a 1 kilowatt system. But in moving up here and moving off grid, we've adapted to having less energy, or kind of set the situation up so we don't need as much electricity, and that means that this system is more than enough, particularly in the summer. In the winter, when the clouds don't break for 3 months, it can get a bit challenging then. But in the summer, not only does this supply all our electricity, it also heats hot water for us, so we don't have to light a fire. So there's just enormous amounts of energy coming out of these panels in the summer. It's incredible. This is the bedding for the chickens. So our bedding is rush grass. So we're putting the rush grass in fresh. Chickens, you know, putting on it and all that sort of stuff. We pull it out and then making these great big mounds out of it. And what's supposed to happen is we get hot composting, and then with these pipes we cycle water around through the heap, and then the hot composting process heats up the water, and then we can use that hot water, so we can get, you know, a compost heap can get to 70 degrees. All right, buddy? Yeah, so when it hot composts, it gets to about 70 degrees centigrade, and if we can get the heat into the water and then out, we get, you know, really hot water for free just off rotting chicken bedding.
I almost became an environmentalist because I wanted to preserve the environment that we have around us. I want to make sure that that environment can be passed on to future generations, and I wanted to very actively be part of policy making to ensure those things can happen, because we know in so many places across the world, if policies allow people to extract minerals, if policy allow people to put fertilisers and chemicals on the land, if policies allow people to cut down the lungs of our planet, they will do so for economic gain. And it's really, really important to me to be part of a government that does not make policies that will enable people trash the future for future generations.
I just want this place to disappear, like it's supposed to be. It's so integrated in the environment, you don't really know it's a farm.
I've chosen my path, and you've chosen yours. I look away and dive right in.
Our biggest problem this year was Storm Hannah, which just stripped all these. Being on a coastal mountain has its challenges, and wind is one of those, so it stripped all the leaves earlier in the year from all our fruit bushes, and that was a problem for the crops. But this is kind of the problem we're facing as we go forward with climate change. Well, climate changing. You never know what's going to happen from year to year. One year it could be a drought like last year, or it could be the wettest summer on record. We don't know what's going to happen, so we're trying to fill the place with as much diversity as possible, so that if one thing's failing, something else is succeeding.
In our country, in the UK, farmers' land bank, so that actually buying land on which to build houses is incredibly expensive. My One Planet development policy has allowed many, many families now to live in the countryside, living in very low cost but low carbon housing, and get good incomes off the land. And by doing so, of course, what we're testing is what ways in which people can return to working with the land in the way that they have done previously.
The One Planet development scheme was always meant to be a pilot project. When we were making this film, there were 23 OPDs up and running across Wales.
Obviously you can't pay your council tax in cabbages, so that has to be generated using a land-based income. So we have to have a business on site that generates a certain amount of cash to pay those bills. So our business, for instance, is in honey and apple juice. We've got about 2 acres of apple orchard, and we keep several beehives on site, and we're planning to scale that up. So the aim is then that after 5 years we have to be meeting those targets.
The chickens are our major source of income. So we're trying to look after the chickens without using any drugs, without using any, as few external inputs as possible. We still have to buy in chicken food at the minute, but we'd like to grow as much of that on site as possible. So we're trying to fill the pasture with useful herbs like clover, chicory. So it's not just grass, it's stuff with more protein in it that'll help the chickens produce their eggs without having to buy in the food.
You can pick these raspberries and they'll really like them.
They really like them.
Against their philosophy, the Watkinsons have put up fences because so many of their free-range chickens were being killed by foxes.
We did have a really bad cull incident. He came and took 30 or so.
In the middle of the day.
I mean, we're trying to embrace all these wild creatures. I mean, one solution is just to go out and shoot the fox, but that's exactly the opposite of what we want to do. If the fox were to just take one every now and again, we wouldn't even notice, and that would be fine, and we'd have a sort of relationship with him. That's all right. You can stay. Everybody has their place. But because they come and it turns into a killing spree, he'd stash 30 in all sorts of corners around the farm, under the bracken and stuff. We can't have the two mix, so we've had to put the fence up as a way to coexist with the fox without having to kill him. In a way that we can still have the chickens. Willow is so good because chickens love to be undercover. They're not really an open plain bird. They're a jungle fowl. That's where they're descended from. So they like to be under the canopy and scratching through leaf litter and things like that. So we're growing the willows for them, for the firewood, for the windbreak. So just damping down the wind, and then they're one of the first things to flower in the spring for the bees.
Daily life offers countless outlets for creative recycling.
So here's one of the tractor tyre paths. They were fine.
But this has worked really well. An old polytunnel frame, and then we've put this on so we can grow things up it, and grow things along the bottom. So we've got baby squash.
Beeview Farm has introduced a lot of other ingenious, eco-friendly systems.
This is a biodigester, so it's one of these old tanks, another just bit of waste from a farm, so it's used to transport chemicals and things like that, but often there's no use for them once they're empty. So we picked up a load of them. One of these insulated, and then we've filled it with water and cow poo, so it's now full of all the bugs that would normally be in a cow's intestinal tract, in its stomach mainly. So what we've created is basically an artificial cow stomach which just sits out here. We can feed it waste food from the kitchen. There's all sorts of stuff in there, a crust of bread and potato peels and fruit peel and stuff like that. We can feed all that into the mouth pipe. That'll then go into the tank, and all those bugs in there start digesting it. But because it's an anaerobic environment inside, rather than turning this food into carbon dioxide as would normally happen, it's turned into methane first, and then we capture the methane. Just this pipe comes off the top of this tank, and then the gas bubbles out up through the water in the bottom of that tank and lifts this third tank up out of the water. So all of the gas inside that tank there is methane gas, and then we've got a pipe going off to the kitchen, and so we can use that methane gas to cook our food on. So we're turning food waste like this, all this stuff that would go in the compost heap or actually a lot of stuff that can't go in the compost heap, like your bread, dairy, meat, anything like that, oil, anything that would attract rats to your compost heap, we can now put that into the biodigester and turn it into gas and turn it into an energy resource that's totally renewable. And it's totally carbon neutral as well. I mean, although we're producing methane, which is horrific if you release it out into the atmosphere, taking it to the kitchen and burning it then turns it into carbon dioxide, which is exactly the same amount of carbon dioxide you would have got if you'd have left this to rot in your compost heap. So you've just created an extra step which gives you a load of energy to use in the meantime.
I've either gotta turn around or learn how to swim.
There's an old olive barrel. We've put a few agitators inside, just screwed some bits of wood on, and then all you have to do is put the water in the washing in and rotate the barrel from washing powder. Well, actually we're not using washing powder, we're using what's called soap nuts. So these are the case of the nut of the soap nut tree, and they feel a bit sticky. They're actually full of saponins, which is a sort of natural soap that we can throw into the washing machine with the clothes, and it will produce its own soap, and that's totally biodegradable, totally natural. So rather than having to deal with washing powder chemicals on the farm, we can now just, you know, it just drains out actually through the reed bed system as well, and no problem. Our wastewater from, say, the shower and the sink is all directed into this reed bed system, which is another three IBC tanks full of gravel, and then yellow iris and reed mace and bulrush, and the combination of those things. So the gravel gets coated in bacteria, huge surface area, lots and lots of bacteria. The rhizomes of the water plants in there are full of bacteria as well that will all digest any organic material, and even I think plenty of chemicals even that come down and out of the sink and the shower into there. They percolate through the first tank, overflows into the second tank, into the third tank, and then by the end you should be getting clean water. We haven't done any science on it, we haven't actually tested the water coming out of there, but it seems pretty obvious to us that the plants in the top tank are, you know, really dark green, really thick. The rush has completely filled it up, and then subsequent tanks are getting sort of sparser and sparser, so that it seems pretty obvious to us that almost all the nutrients coming down from the house are taken out by the plants in the first tank, and then there's less and less available for those two tanks. So I think it's pretty obvious the system is working.
A summer long ago, a little seed was sown by a farmer with no shade. The hourglass of time, he watched it slowly climb, while he began to fade, and we shade from our trees.
To win approval for their One Planet development, the Watkinsons had to show that they could not only live sustainably off their 3 acres, but that their farm would not damage the local flora and fauna. Although the couple have used second-hand vehicles for their temporary home, their small holding is designed to blend into the surrounding landscape as much as it can. Recently planted trees and shrubs also help to shroud the buildings and the chicken arks, and there's no noticeable smell from the hens and ducks whatsoever. The fact that the National Park, the One Planet Council and the County Council have given the couple their full support has not seemed to convince the hearts and minds of those against them that what they're doing is wholly beneficial to the land and the neighbourhood. Objections to them being there seem to revolve around the fact that they've dared to be different. Given the climate crisis on our hands and the need for everyone to reduce their carbon footprint, it's hard to see how anyone could be against them.
You know, I think they just see us as sort of normal neighbours with a fairly normal small holding. We're not crazy hippies or anything. We're relatively normal people. I think OPD can be mainstream. You know, I think at the school gate we don't look any different from anyone else. Maybe occasionally we arrive on the electric bicycle and that's a bit of a talking point, but you could do that from a normal small holding too. I mean, ultimately all new development has to be one planet development in the sense of taking up no more than a fair share of one planet's resources. So in that way I don't see OPD as being different at all. It just happens to be getting there first. So if we want Wales to be a one planet nation within a generation, as the One Wales, One Planet Sustainable Development Scheme commits us to, then what does that look like? That means that everything should be one planet development. Everything should be considering the impact on future generations and should be considering the carbon impact of building and etc. etc.
Wales is the only country in the world to have legislation that requires people to actually deliver sustainable development policies. There are other countries in the world that have a range of other initiatives around sustainability, because of course when we had the Earth Summit in Rio back in 1992, many countries made the commitment. What they have found subsequently though, it's really hard. And it's because it's really hard that I ended up proposing legislation. Because many, many countries have experimented with the idea of a Future Generations Commissioner, have actively tried to put sustainable development throughout their policies. But what we've seen in the last few years is most of those countries are no longer doing anything in the context of sustainable development. And I was really keen that in Wales, as a small nation that was right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, which was the first country in the world to sign a £1 million cheque in its coal exchange, that we should be right at the beginning of a new kind of future.
Now, if the kids are in a bad mood, they'll find a muddy puddle or a stinging patch to fall into, and then that's it. Then
yeah, we'll have to make them their own ark and stick them in it for the day.
I think that would be a great idea if we could just shut them in an ark for the day.
But when they're older and making choices and value decisions later, I hope this will help them. What's the word? I don't know. Make the right choice. Make choices that work for them.